transport hubs, critical transport hubs, as they're being called. What other steps do you expect the security services to be taking?
Well, I mean, I think the immediate response in any incident like this is, as I say, to sort of get on top of the networks you were slightly concerned about. Often intelligence agencies will sort of watch networks and try to understand a bit better where they're going. I think whenever you have an attack like this take place, there does tend to be a sort of immediate responsive crackdown, shut down whatever investigations you have to make sure that that you haven't misjudged something and that you haven't sort of missed something, so that you don't sort of have a group that maybe sees this action as a potential trigger for them to quickly move into action for fear of being disrupted. We can think back to the Paris incident and the sort of subsequent arrest that we saw from that. And the arrest of Saleh Abdel-Salam actually accelerated the process of the Brussels cell launching their attack on the Brussels International Airport for fear of actually being disrupted. Well, when you have an attack like this, other cells will immediately start thinking, well, hold on, is our network compromised? Do they know? Are they onto us as a result of this incident? Will they be onto us quicker? And so they will maybe accelerate any plans that they have. And I think for Russian security forces, the job will be to immediately get on top of that and immediately make sure that you haven't got any sort of loose ends out there that might culminate in sort of follow-up atrocities.
Raffaello, stand by for just a couple of minutes. I'd like to keep speaking to you just a little later on. Let's hear what the Russian President Vladimir Putin had to say, because what he said earlier on is that all angles are being investigated. Listen.
I would like to express my sincerest condolences to relatives of the killed and wounded. I have already spoken with the chiefs of special services, FSB director, law enforcement bodies and special services. We will do everything to identify the reasons for what happened, give a full evaluation of what happened, and city and federal authorities will do everything possible to support the families of our killed and injured citizens.
So that was Putin speaking a little earlier on after the attack took place in St. Petersburg, that blast in the subway station. Let's speak to Fred Weir. He's a journalist. He's joining us from Moscow. Can you tell me what you're hearing about St. Petersburg?
Well, this is, of course, the kind of shock that comes up every so often. We have had a long period of peace and quiet here in Russia. All the terrorism that was a decade ago has sort of faded from the public mind. And since then, of course, there has been the Russian intervention in Syria, which probably changes everything, but we haven't felt it yet. This is, aside from the bombing of that airliner in Sinai, this sort of thing hasn't happened in central Russia for 5 years.
So what's been the reaction of people that you have been speaking to? What have people been telling you?
Well, people are shocked and horrified, as is always the case when these things happen. I mean, I was said to an interview to the people for a housing story, and partners were seeing it on the news and shaking their heads, and I saw one woman crying. Of course, this is the wake-up call for Russia.
We understand as well that children could be amongst the dead and the injured. Have you heard that?
I don't know. I've heard 10 dead and dozens wounded. It's really too soon to say. I guess they'll be cleaning that up, and the list will come out within the next few hours. But it is a serious. I mean, it is the worst act of terrorism in the Russian heartland in several years now.
Why would St. Petersburg be targeted this way?
I think it would be more a matter of opportunity. It really, I mean, I can't think of any reason other than what's going on in Syria and in Bulgaria. Same kind of thing that's happening around Europe. People motivated by the war in the Middle East are taking, these kind of terrorist actions. And there was no reason why Russia should be immune if it is an active participant there. And so a major Russian city, Moscow, there are a couple others, that would be the logic.
Well, important to highlight at this point that there has been no claim of responsibility as of now, and we still don't know the reason behind that attack. But you keep mentioning Syria. So, if that were to be the case, would this put pressure on Russia to change its stance on Syria, to change, the geopolitics?
No, absolutely. I mean, does it put pressure on France, who are also involved in the Middle East, when terrorist actions happen there? It will only strengthen the government's resolve. They will give statements to resolve, and the public will accept that.
All right, Fred Weir, we'll leave it there. We thank you for joining us from Moscow. Well, this is not the first time that Russia has been targeted. So just last year, 2 ISIL supporters attempted to murder police officers near Moscow. Both attackers, armed with a gun and axes, were killed. In December 2013, 2 separate suicide bombings targeted the city of Volgograd, that's in southern Russia. 34 people killed at the time. A separatist group demanding independence from Muslim states in the North Caucasus region claimed responsibility. In 2010, 2 suicide bomb attacks hit the metro system in Moscow. At least 40 people were killed in the attacks, also linked to the North Caucasus separatist group. Earlier, we spoke to Dmitry Babich. He's a journalist for the Voice of Russia radio station, for his take on the attack.
President Putin already met the head of the Russian security service, FSB. Putin said that 3 versions of what happened are discussed. One of them is a terrorist act for political reasons, but the other 2 versions are, kind of less political. It's about some kind of a business conflict or personal revenge. But, of course, the version of a politically motivated terrorist act is the main one right now. People are, of course, pretty sad about what happened, but in general, Russia is no novice to terrorism. We have been a target of terrorist attack during the 90s and in the more recent years. In fact, there were terrorist attacks even in the times of the Soviet Union. They were just not reported as largely as they're reported now. So people are prepared for the worst, and if the terrorists had a political aim, I think they won't achieve their objective, because President Putin is not a man to change his policies under pressure. He has been known for that for many years, and people would support this kind of attitude, because the general mood in Russia is that if you give in to terrorists, they're going to demand more and more next time. In Moscow metro, for example, in the year 2004, there was an explosion in the train, but as you might calculate, that was 12 years ago. So people are of course shocked by the fact that this kind of terrorism is returning. But Moscow and St. Petersburg were no novices to terrorism. Everyone understands that the subway, the metro, this is the most vulnerable part of the city, because it's usually filled with people, crammed with people, and any explosion there can be very damaging. So Moscow has been preparing for that. We have a system which checks people's belongings when they enter the metro. It sort of detects explosive devices. Everyone understands that there can be no zero risk. There is always some risk of a terrorist attack, but this time we are much better prepared than 12 years ago.
Let's cross back to Raffaello Pantucci, who's joining us from London. Was the risk of a quote-unquote terrorist attack in Russia high at this point?
I think that the risk in Russia has been high for some time. We've seen a number of terrorist attacks and a number of threats by terrorist groups towards Russia. And I think what's particularly, concerning for Russian security forces is the growing presence of Russian-speaking citizens in sort of terrorist networks. So if we think back to the attacks in New Year's in Turkey at the nightclub that was conducted by an individual who I think was originally of Uzbek extraction, so therefore sort of a citizen of the CIS countries. countries who would have been able theoretically to travel to Russia on his passport. If we look at the attack on Ataturk airport that happened earlier last year, again, that was conducted by citizens from the sort of former Soviet Union. And I think what's worrying is that we've seen a growing number of these individuals showing up in sort of terrorist networks that are affiliated with Islamic State, but also with other groups. And whenever you see that,
but when you say growing
yes.
numbers, how big are these numbers, and how prevalent are these Russian-speaking citizens that you speak of in what are considered terrorist groups?
Well, I think that the ballpark numbers that we see circulating is somewhere in the region of 7,000 who've gone from the sort of broader former Soviet space to fight in Syria and Iraq. These numbers are quite broad, and it's not exactly clear exactly what timescale and everything we're looking at. But I think we're looking at a fairly substantial body of people. And I think what's concerning from a sort of Russian perspective is that a lot of these individuals, in some cases, have come from the sort of Caucasian networks who ultimately have a great sort of anger towards Russia at the root of their sort of radicalization, and their decision to go and fight in a place like Syria and Iraq is motivated in part to go and sort of see the fight and the war that's happening there, but also to receive training and preparation to try to ultimately return home and attack the enemy that they see in Moscow.
All right, Raffaello, thank you for the time being. We'll get another perspective, speak to Domitilla Sagramoso, a Russia analyst at the Department of War Studies at King's College, also joining us from London. Your reaction to the attack in St. Petersburg?
As I said earlier on, this is a very sad moment for the families and the victims, and I think it brings back again the war to Russia. As I mentioned earlier, there are several sensitive points for Russia, not only its involvement in Syria, but a very tense situation in the North Caucasus, although the levels of violence in that area are much lower. We also know that there are a lot of members from Central Asian countries, from Muslim in Central Asia, who've been participating in the insurgency in Syria. So it's a bit early to know exactly who is behind this attack. There hasn't been, so far as I know, any claims. It's very much sort of early moments until we have more information and a lot more material and forensic evidence is gathered to give us a bit of an idea of who may have been behind this attack.
What would be the message? I understand that it is early and we yet don't have a claim of responsibility, but from what you're seeing and the way that this attack was carried out, what would be the message that's being sent out?
Well, it depends very much who is behind it, but generally terrorist attacks, by definition, they try to send a political message to the leadership, either to alter their policies or stop some kind of military operation. They also try to instill fear among the population so that potentially the population can exert pressure on the government to change its behavior. It is an attempt to show the pain that many may have been suffering in these wars, and so to equalize the level of pain that people are suffering under, for example, Russian bombs, to show to people in Russia what they are suffering. So there might be many motives. What is very relevant, I think, as was mentioned by a previous speaker, is the fact that it occurred in a city where Putin was present.
Which I wanted to ask you about, exactly, with the presence of Vladimir Putin in St. Petersburg. Can one safely say that this was timed with his visit to St. Petersburg? And if so, is the message directed at Putin himself?
Well, I mean, it could have been timed, and that may indicate that those who were perpetrating the attacks were more familiar sort of with the Russian political schedule. So it certainly might be a message sent directly to President Putin, a clear sign of disapproval of his policies, a sign that they can hit him close to home, not only in one of the big cities of Russia, but also his own hometown and a town where he is there at the moment. So it might show, indicate that Russia has not been able fully to protect big cities when the president is traveling there. So it might indicate a sign of weakness. And to this.
Okay, Domitella, we thank you for speaking to us. Well, let's just take a closer look at the exact location of that attack. So the explosion took place on the Blue Line in central St. Petersburg between the Senaya Ploshad and the Technologicheski Institute metro stations. Russian media is reporting the blast hit the Senaya metro station itself. Now, the state news agency says an explosive device was set off on board the subway car. Military analyst Pavel Felgenhauer joins us via Skype from Moscow. Your initial reaction to St. Petersburg, to the blast in St. Petersburg?
Well, it's a very sad event. Russia did experience terrorist attacks for some